This is the city from which Germany has been governed since the Bismarck era. For 12 years, Berlin was the capital of the Third Reich. Buildings constructed by the Nazis can still be found in the city today. Though Hitler wasn't fond of Berlin, he did succeed in leaving a lasting impression on its cityscape. Relics from the National Socialist past turn up in unusual places. Hitler's aim was to transform Berlin into the future world capital of Germania. Some of the structures from that era provide an insight into his megalomaniac vision. When the Reich's fall became inevitable, Hitler opted to stay in the unloved capital until the end. The former local Gau headquarters at Friedrichshain survived the war and the fall of the Reich. Today, the building houses a publishing company. This massive construction was quite deliberately erected on this site in the mid-1930s, as it was right next door to a public hall in which Hitler's stormtroopers and the communists used to brawl at political meetings. True to the style of the National Socialist approach to art, the pompous staircase is lined with natural stone. Even though Gauleiter Josef Goebbels was rarely seen here, the building's purpose was to keep the memory of the Nazi victory alive in Red Berlin. On Hitler's orders, Goebbels came to the capital of the Weimar Republic on the 9th of November 1926 with the mission to make the quarreling party members see reason. Within a few years, the talented propagandist transformed the radical splinter group into a powerful organization. Right next door to the Gau House, the Nazis built a housing estate for deserving fighters for the movement, which also survived the war. In honor of the Gauleiter, it was named Goebbels Heimstätte, or Goebbels Homestead. Berlin-based journalist Sven Felix Kellerhoff has been investigating the history of these well-preserved buildings for a long time. Many of his publications deal with the city's National Socialist past.
The strategy of Josef Goebbels when he became the new Gauleiter can be summed up in a single word: provocation. He would deliberately send his stormtroopers to march across working-class areas, accepting the fact that many of his own people would get injured or even killed in the fighting, because he only had one goal. He wanted publicity, wanted to be noticed. His aim was to spread the notion in the German public that the communists were preparing for civil war and a revolution, so that he and the National Socialists would then appear as the saviors of the nation, and evidently his strategy worked.
From the party headquarters at Wilhelmsplatz, Gauleiter Goebbels resolutely paved his Führer's way to power in Berlin. This building in the Zimmerstraße was bricked up during the GDR years as it bordered on the Berlin Wall. Up until the end of the war, it housed one of the head offices of Goebbels' propaganda instruments. It was the seat of the party newspapers Völkischer Beobachter and Angriff. After the accession to power in 1933, members of the opposition were tortured to death in its cellars. Yet the building marks an even more important event in the history of Hitler's Berlin. In 1927, the Führer gave his first official speech in the German capital in a dance club named Klu in this courtyard. As Hitler was banned from speaking publicly for many years, he gave his first speeches in Berlin at private meetings. After the ban was lifted, he would soon fill larger halls, such as the Neue Welt and the Sportpalast, with people willing to listen to his inflammatory anti-Semitic speeches. Despite his success, Hitler sustained a love-hate relationship with Berlin for the rest of his life.
He didn't like big cities. He rejected this way of life because he felt it was Jewish modernistic. However, he knew that ultimately the only way to power in Germany was by conquering the cities, and in particular by conquering the Reich's capital.
On the 30th of January 1933, Hitler left his abode in Berlin, the Hotel Kaiserhof, to take over the government. The restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, the world economic crisis and unemployment drove many voters to the Nazi Party. In order to make the world believe that Germany was a peace-loving country, the Nazis staged the 1936 Olympic Summer Games in Berlin. Hitler personally oversaw the designing of the Olympiastadion and the adjacent sports facilities.
Im Reichssportfeld wird für die Feier der 11. Olympiade eine einzigartige Kampfstätte geschaffen. Das Kernstück des weiten Reichssportfeldes ist das Olympiastadion, die Deutsche Kampfbahn. Um den Innenraum erheben sich Zuschauerplätze für mehr als 100.000 Personen. Unzählige Arbeiter sind Tag und Nacht am Werk. Auch sie schaffen in ihrer Art für die olympische Idee. Wie das ganze deutsche Volk bemüht ist, seinen Gästen einen würdigen Empfang zu bereiten.
Hitler
was involved in the choice of the stone to be used in the architectural plans almost from the beginning in 1934. He visited the construction site several times and directly intervened in many issues. In the presence of the French ambassador, André-François Poncet, Hitler said that he didn't like the stadium. He thought it looked too modern.
Hitler war das noch zu modern.
Ich verkünde die Spiele von Berlin zur Feier der 11. Olympiade neuer Zeitrechnung als eröffnet.
From his seat in the VIP stand, the dictator was forced to watch as a black US athlete, of all people, became the favorite among the spectators, including the Germans. Jesse Owens beat Hitler's top Aryan athletes to win 4 gold medals. Nearly 4,000 athletes from 49 nations took part in the Games. Most male contestants were housed in the Olympic Village in Döberitz near Berlin. Today the complex stands empty. The area is fenced and the windows of the small houses are boarded up. Back in 1936, the Olympic Village was proudly presented in propaganda films. Foreign journalists were obviously impressed too.
The world would be a happier place,
wrote the correspondent of the British Observer,
if the youth of all nations could be brought together in this way more frequently.
The Second World War shattered this vision. After the end of the Games, the complex was used by the Wehrmacht until the Red Army occupied the area in 1945. Since the departure of the Soviet troops in 1992, the buildings have been empty, scarcely protected from the elements. Little remains of the time when the novel medium of television transmitted live from the Games and the Olympic Village.
Der aktuelle Bilddienst des Fernsehsenders Paul Nipkow lädt Sie heute ein zu einem Streifzug durch das olympische Dorf. Nun durch das Tor, vorbei am Pförtner und nun sind wir drin. Auf dem viel gelästerten märkischen Sand ist ein kleines Paradies entstanden. Die deutsche Wehrmacht hat es erbaut. Hier ein paar Aktive vor dem Hause Dessau. Wundervoll passen sich die Häuser der Landschaft an und sie sind auch herrlich, massiv und fest gebaut. Es muss ein wundervolles Wohnen sein. Und immer dabei ein Junge vom Olympischen Ehrendienst. Und hier ein amerikanisches Superschwergewicht.
Today, many of the buildings are very run down. So far, no one has thought of a way to put this extensive site to good use. The old indoor swimming pool, where in 1936 the athletes would prepare for their races, is partly burned out. For 2 weeks, Nazi Germany presented itself to the outside world as a peace-loving nation. The Games brought international acceptance for the Third Reich. Only a few far-sighted people realized the Nazis' true intentions. The Jewish novelist Victor Klemperer, for instance, wrote in his diary,
"It is continuously drummed into Germans as well as visitors that what one sees here is the upswing, the blossoming, the new spirit, the unity, the glory and the splendor, and naturally also the peaceful spirit of the Third Reich that affectionately embraces the whole world. The chants and the persecution of the Jews are all forbidden, and the offensive articles have disappeared from the newspapers for the duration of the Olympiad, until the 16th of August.
The less peace-loving face of the new Germany manifested itself at the huge Olympic Tower at the western end of the Reich sports field. It was here that a solemn commemorative service took place for the students who, in 1914, supposedly threw themselves into the machine gun fire of their enemies in Langemarck, Belgium, defying death, an ominous warning for what would happen here later in April 1945. Yet at first, after the end of the Olympic Games, the area was frequently used as a marching ground for National Socialist propaganda functions. It was mainly young people who were impressed by the mystic pomp of the Nazis. Television journalist Reinhard Appel took part in many mass marches in the presence of the dictator in the Olympic Park when he was a boy.
Being in the Hitler Youth,
we would often get orders to applaud or shout Heil at large-scale events. And I was one of those who was supposed to shout Heil. It was 1938, I remember, and there was a celebration for the Hitler Youth, and the whole Reich sports field was full of boys.
Die Hitlerjugend zu übergeben quasi. Und da war ich einer derjenigen, der Spaß daran hatte, diese
Back then, I thought it was funny to start off a wave of hailing. Nowadays, you'd call it a Mexican wave. So I would start yelling, Heil, and was very pleased when the entire stadium would respond and follow suit, until I was noticed by a Hitler Youth leader and was thrown out for improper behavior.
Because the National Socialist Youth was to be systematically indoctrinated, the Hitler Youth homes erected all over the Third Reich were identical. A prototype can still be seen today in the northern outskirts of Berlin. It was designed in the style of a rural half-timbered house and presented at a propaganda show on Berlin's exhibition grounds. Later it was transferred here to the Volkspark Rehberge. Physical fitness was paramount for National Socialist youths. Military training began at a very early age. The Hitler Youth homes served the purpose of controlling the boys' spare time. The date, 1936, can still be made out on the fireguard, and little else has changed in the festive hall of the former Hitler Youth home. Only the Nazi symbols were removed after the end of the war. Today, the home is used as a recreational facility for mentally handicapped children. During the Nazi regime, people like these would be categorized as unworthy to live and ruthlessly murdered. During the mid-1930s, administration buildings in the style of the New Era were erected all over Berlin. Air Minister Hermann Göring had an entire street front demolished at the Wilhelmstrasse in order to create a suitable official building for his ministry. Gradually, the entire government district was given the architectural features of the National Socialist spirit. In the west of Berlin, at Fährberliner Platz, a monumental complex of office buildings constructed during the Third Reich has survived to this day. The Rudolf Karstadt Corporation built its head office in Berlin right across from the Nordstern life insurance complex. It was decorated with National Socialist art, scenes from the working life of the community of the people. The total Führer state had become a reality and had found visible expression in the architecture. Hitler had very clear ideas about the redesigning of his capital. Berlin was to become the symbol of Germany's international standing. His plans covered over half of the urban area. In 1938, the Victory Column, the symbol of the capitulation of France in 1871, was relocated from its position in front of the Reichstag to the newly constructed east-west axis. This connecting route was built by Albert Speer, the Inspector General of Construction for the redesigning of the Reichscapital, and still dominates Berlin today. 5 road intersections form the so-called Great Star. The 10-lane main arterial road, planned for Hitler's triumphal processions, points exactly to the west. The east-west axis was inaugurated on the Führer's 50th birthday on the 20th of April 1939. In the years that followed, military parades were frequently held here. This footage shows the Legion Condor after its return from the Spanish Civil War. The street lamps on the east-west axis were designed by Albert Speer himself. They still flank part of the thoroughfare. Even beyond the government district, administrative buildings in the Reichscapital were also constructed in the architectural style of National Socialism. The tax office for the borough of Charlottenburg, for example, was moved into a representative monumental building in 1939. The eagle relief above the main entrance is still intact. Only the swastika was removed after 1945. Hitler boasted,
"Others may live in the Kremlin or in a castle, but we will make sure that the buildings representing the Reich originate in our own time."
The most important project in Berlin between 1936 and 1938 was the expansion of the Reich Chancellery. Designed by Albert Speer, the overstated neoclassical architecture of Hitler's center of government stood for the power and the potency of National Socialist Germany. Its monumental dimensions were to dwarf the old buildings from the Kaiser era. Director Leni Riefenstahl and her camera were there when workers put the finishing touches on Hitler's new Chancellery of the Reich. On the 7th of January 1939, the architect personally showed his employer around the finished rooms. He had to construct the building within a year, Speer wrote later in his memoirs. But like many of these tales, this is pure fabrication. In reality, the architect had begun planning the Chancellery by the end of 1935. The Chancellery of the Reich was to serve primarily for representation. With its endless corridors, the dictator wanted to overwhelm foreign diplomats so that on the long way to the reception hall, they would get an idea of the true grandeur of the Third Reich. Original marble slabs from the long gallery of the Chancellery can be seen today in the Mohrenstrasse underground station in the middle of Berlin's government district. They were installed here after the end of the war. Most passengers are oblivious to the relics of the country's brown past. Nothing refers to their original use. Naturally, Albert Speer also designed the reception rooms and the Führer's study very grandiously. This way, the dictator was able to achieve the desired effects at the New Year's reception for the diplomatic corps. The ruins of the Chancellery of the Reich were eradicated by the Soviet occupying power after the end of the war, and the last remnants of the Führer's bunker disposed of by GDR authorities in 1988. However, 2 years later, in 1990, a forgotten bunker used by the dictator's motor pool drivers was discovered accidentally. The bunker, built in 1940, comprises 8 small rooms. The rooms were used by the SS escort commandos of the Adolf Hitler Bodyguard Regiment. It seems that during the last days of the war, SS soldiers had barricaded themselves here.
This entire corner was full of stored ammunition. Infantry ammunition, hand grenades, bazookas, rifles, pistols. We therefore assumed that this room was the changing room and served as the arms depot at the same time. In one of the rooms, amateurish attestations of National Socialist art were discovered. Enormous wall paintings glorifying the heroic service of SS soldiers. After the archaeological survey, the bunker was closed off again. "I want Berlin to be more beautiful than Paris ever was," Hitler apparently said after viewing the occupied capital of France. The megalomania of the dictator in designing the new Berlin knew no bounds. More and more new sketches and drafts were created on the drawing tables of the Inspector General of Construction for the Reich's capital. Hitler had been dreaming of gigantic edifices since his youth. Now, Albert Speer was designing them for him. The architect calculated annual costs of up to 500 million Reichsmarks. He had models made on a 1:50 scale and created a small imaginary city, which he proudly presented to his patron. The dictator hoped that everything would be finished within 20 years. Hitler's vision of the world capital, Germania, involved pulling down large parts of the city centre to make room for new, magnificent buildings. The inhabitants of the houses were resettled into dwellings that had belonged to deported Jews. However, the architect and his assistants were not sure whether the grand plans to build Germania were technically feasible. They were concerned that, after all, they might remain a vision. Would Berlin's underground be strong enough to bear the enormous loads of stone and concrete? The experts were asking themselves. To test this, they had an immense, odd-looking concrete cylinder built, which still stands today in the Tempelhof district. Due to its unusual shape, the locals have nicknamed it Pilz, the mushroom. Dietmar Arnold from the Berlin Underworlds Association is one of the experts in little-known relics from Berlin's National Socialist past. Arnold, a civil engineer, has also investigated the history of this unusual structure, which, up until a few years ago, was still used for soil mechanical experiments by the Technical University of Berlin. This structure is a load-testing body built by French slave labourers in 1940 to 41 to establish whether the huge buildings planned for Germania could be erected on Berlin's soil. This was a stability test. When this giant was completed in 1941, its total weight was 12,600 tons. Engineers found it had subsided by 20 centimetres and slanted by 3.5 centimetres. But because of the immense load exerted here compared to a regular building, they thought this wouldn't present a problem, declaring Germania feasible, using this structure as proof. A model made for Hitler demonstrated how the north-south axis, starting from the gigantic Südbahnhof station, would pass a 117-metre-tall triumphal arch and end at the monstrous domed Volkshalle. Hitler had demanded that his capital match the magnitude of his mission. Speer's engineers had worked assiduously on a 3-metre-tall model of the Great Hall. The architectural design of Germania can be summarized in one word: exaggeration. The Great Hall, which was to be 290 meters high, is the most gigantic and also the best-known project of Hitler's plans for Germania. It would have been absolutely impossible to realize the hall with the technology of the time. If cost were no object, it would probably be possible to build it today. However, it would be impossible to predict how long it would stand, or whether it would survive a heavy spring or autumn storm.
Das kann man überhaupt nicht sagen.
The Great Hall, with a capacity of 120,000 people, was to be built out there, to the north of where we stand and south of the Lehrter Bahnhof. In front of it would be an enormous assembly square, 6 times the size of St. Peter's Square in Rome, bordered by enormous dominant edifices. The Reichstag would have been demoted to an auxiliary building. An important part of the designs was the traffic planning. 4 tunnel sections were already completed by 1940, but then construction work was suspended as not essential to the war effort. 3 tunnel sections are still intact, 2 road tunnels and a 220-meter-long subway tunnel, and can be visited. Actually, these tunnels are the last remnants of Germania that still exist in this area.
Somewhere in the Tiergarten is the carefully concealed entrance to one of the 2 road tunnels. The Senate administration of the capital aims to prevent unauthorized entry. The descent is dangerous, with the likelihood of poisonous gas being an added risk. At the moment, the air is clear. Dietmar Arnold can describe the construction on site.
Ja, wir sind jetzt hier knapp 9 Meter unterm Tiergarten.
We're now about 9 meters below the Tiergarten, in the western tunnel of the junction of the 2 axes. It's nearly 90 meters long, 14 wide and 4.8 meters high, and would have become an expressway tunnel. These are remnants of Germania. The junction of the axes was the point of intersection of the planned east-west and north-south axes. Only the east-west axis was completed to a large extent. Today it consists of the Straße des 17. Juni and Unter den Linden, while the north-south axis was never built. This is what remains today of these preposterous plans. This tunnel was rediscovered as late as 1967. As you can see here, the roof has been renovated. The authorities have calculated that it's cheaper to just leave them as they are.
Cars never drove through this tunnel. At some point during the war, a partition was evidently erected. Armament production is said to have been relocated here to escape the bomb hazard. All that remains of it now is a rusty lamp. At the other end, Dietmar Arnold has discovered evidence that the tunnel was also used by civilians as an air raid shelter during the Allied bombings.
This is the access staircase where people used to enter. What I think is particularly interesting is the extent of wear on the rungs. It shows that masses of people must have used them to get into the tunnel. In fact, this staircase could have been used by the Civil Air Defense. The top was concreted over in the 1960s.
Im Befehlsstand der Luftverteidigung Berlin. Es wird ein Terrorangriff der britisch-amerikanischen Luftpiraten auf die Reichshauptstadt erwartet. Auf einer großen Leuchtkarte wird der Anflugweg der Feindmaschinen eingezeichnet. Der Feind hat die Stadtgrenze erreicht. Flakartillerie und Nachtjäger bereiten ihm einen heißen Empfang. Abschuss!
Newsreels have been calling on the people to put up fanatical resistance since the beginning of the Allied air raids. The propaganda films were made in the ministry of Joseph Goebbels, not far from the Chancellery. The Minister for Propaganda, a fanatic acolyte of Hitler's, had this representative official building constructed in the mid-1930s. From here, he exercised total control over public opinion in the Third Reich, leaving nothing to chance. Today, the federal government uses the monumental building as the Ministry for Labour and Social Affairs. In the same rooms where Vice-Chancellor Franz Müntefering confers with his assistants today, the Nazis were drafting their propaganda battles over 60 years ago. As the war progressed, Goebbels became a kind of home front dictator, trying to whitewash the bitter truth of the bomb war and appealing to the Germans to bear up. However, the minister had taken precautions regarding his own security. A bomb-proof private shelter was built beneath his official residence. The remainders of this bunker were discovered accidentally during construction work in 1998 and sealed up again shortly afterwards. Little is known about the setup of Goebbels' bunker. Apparently, the rooms were not luxuriously furnished, yet the minister could be permanently in touch with the outside world by means of a modern telephone system. His diaries reveal that, in the case of an air raid alarm, he would go either to his private shelter or to the underground command post at Wilhelmsplatz. On the 24th of November 1943, the minister wrote in his diary,
"The raid begins shortly after the alarm has sounded. This time they deploy more high explosive than incendiary bombs. This is another large-scale air raid. The fires are starting all around us, and the entire government district is hit by substantial bombs and mines. They devastate the area around Potsdamer Platz. The blast waves are so strong that even our bunker deep under the ground is rattling. The noise above us is hellish."
Later on, he continues,
"When I look around Wilhelmsplatz after the raid, the grim impressions of the night before are confirmed."
Within just a few days, 3,700 Berliners were killed and 450,000 became homeless. A few days later, in the Titania Palast, Goebbels gave one of his fanatical endurance speeches, culminating in the slogan, "The whole of Germany is crying for revenge." The Allied air raids made survival for the few Jews remaining in Berlin even more difficult. They could not seek safety in a shelter, so they had to look for new hiding places in the outskirts of the city if they wanted to avoid the dreaded catchers. Since 1941, over 50,000 of Berlin's Jews had been taken to the ghettos and concentration camps in the east. Few of them survived. During the so-called Fabrikaktion, or factory raids, at the end of February 1943, another 8,000 or more Jews working as slave laborers were displaced by the Gestapo. The old Jewish hospital in the Scheunenviertel, or Bahn district, had been used as a home for refugee children from Eastern Europe since the First World War. From 1941 to 1943, the Nazis misappropriated the building as an assembly camp for Berlin Jews before deporting them to the extermination camps. In most cases, the deportees weren't told the day they would leave the assembly camp.
Ich habe mir Geld verdient, indem ich Brötchen ausgeteilt habe.
I was making some money by delivering rolls in the morning before school. One of the people I would deliver to was a Jewish physician in Spandau. I will never forget the distrustful, frightened eyes of his wife every time I rang the bell to let them know that the rolls were there. She was in constant fear of being arrested by the Nazis.
Weil sie sich ängstete, wer mag geklingelt haben und vielleicht sollten wir jetzt abgeholt werden.
The dictator made very few public appearances during the war, fearing he would become the target of an Allied precision attack, and he was rarely in Berlin. The longest he stayed in the Reich capital was 10 days in 1943. As a result, he had no first-hand experience of what his subjects were going through.
Adolf Hitler war
Adolf Hitler was in Berlin in the autumn of 1940 during several relatively minor air raids. By chance, or what Adolf Hitler would have called premonition, he happened not to be in Berlin during any of the heavy raids from the beginning of 1941 to the autumn of 1944. Sometimes he would board his private train and leave Berlin just a few hours before a raid. Sometimes he didn't come to Berlin for several months. In any case, Hitler never visited any of the areas hit. He left that to his propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels.
In February 1944, Goebbels wrote in his diary,
"The Führer has expressed very warm words for the composure of Berlin's population. He stresses that Berlin has truly become the Reich's capital during the air raids of the previous months. The bravery of Berlin's citizens demonstrated during the attacks was not thought possible in large parts of the German nation and in the entire world."
Still, Nazi leaders were looking into improved protection measures for the citizens from the bombs so as to keep up their resolve on the home front. More and more residential buildings were hit or destroyed in a firestorm by the Allied high-explosive or incendiary bombs. A result of these deliberations can be seen in a forest 100 kilometers north of Berlin. Odd-looking shelter constructions on the grounds of the former secret Luftwaffe test site in Rechtlin. The locals have named them White Houses. Documents of the time provide information concerning the purpose of the mysterious shelters. According to them, incendiary bombs were tested on these towers in July and August 1943. The documents refer to a Berlin borough, so these buildings may have been model houses for Hitler's capital, Germania, which were tested here to see just how bomb-proof they were. Were Berlin citizens to survive the bombing attacks in this way, in standardized houses with built-in shelter towers from reinforced concrete? There is no clear answer to this question. The results of the bombing tests on these prototypes are also unknown. By then, the sirens howled in Berlin almost daily. Sometimes, people had to spend entire days and nights in the air raid shelters. Latecomers were faced with locked doors. Going in and out of shelters became everyday routine for many Berliners, including the staff and patients of the city's hospitals. At the former Humboldt Hospital on Teichstrasse, one of these bomb-proof shelters is open to visitors. It was built in the vicinity of the main building in 1942 and served as an operation shelter, Type A. When the alarm sounded, the post-operative patients were taken from the hospital straight into the shelter through a subterranean passage over a ramp. Behind the protection of heavy iron gates and thick reinforced concrete, the doctors could even perform complicated surgical operations. Filter systems protected physicians, nurses and patients from poisonous gases. Today, this relic from Hitler's Berlin is supervised by the Berlin Underworlds Association.
Patients had to be operated on during the bombing attacks too. However, the hospitals were not bomb-proof, and the Allied bombers, flying at an altitude of 7,000 or 8,000 meters, could not drop their payload accurately enough to spare the hospitals, which had red crosses painted on the roof. From March 1944 onwards, when the Americans started to bomb Berlin during the day, operations were always performed in the shelters. As far as the equipment was available, nearly all hospitals moved their operating rooms into the shelters simply for safety reasons. Altogether, we had 28 operation shelters in Berlin. Every major hospital had one or two. The fact that this one is so well preserved is actually just a historical coincidence. It was used for many years as a storage facility for the Senate, until our association took this shelter under our wing 1.5 years ago. Now we're gradually restoring it.
Fittings and surgical instruments from the time were collected from all around Germany in order to outfit the shelter as accurately in every detail as possible. After Joseph Goebbels' declaration of total war, his propaganda machinery kept inventing new rallying calls. "Our walls are broken, but not our hearts," was one of the cynical slogans. Others included, "The warring city of Berlin greets the Führer," and "Führer command, we will obey." Despite the precautions the Nazis had taken, Berlin city centre was also heavily hit by bombs several times. On Hitler's orders, 3 enormous anti-aircraft towers had been hurriedly erected for the protection of the government district. The remains of one of these flak towers can still be found today at Humboldthain, north of the city centre. The reinforced concrete giant was only partly destroyed when the victors tried to demolish it. A few years ago, the Berlin Underworlds Association was granted permission to open the existing entrances and explore the tower's interior. Tons of rubble were removed from the ruin before a first inspection of the bizarre bunker system became possible. Gradually, elevator shafts and former ammunition depots were revealed. It was sometimes a risky business for the researchers. Today, parts of the gigantic structure are accessible. The structure was shaken by the blasting attempts of the Allies after the war. The ceiling sagged visibly. Whether or not they will cave in one day is unclear. When put into service in 1942, the flak tower was classified as indestructible, and this is obviously still true today, if only partly. A network of corridors and staircases extend as deep as 8 stories below the ground.
Maybe we should put up a proper fence here, down there at the back. This is as far as it goes. We're now in the so-called turret 3 of the Humboldt-Hain flak tower, an anti-aircraft tower which consisted of 4 gun turrets. Facing us here are the main elevator shaft and the main spiral staircase. The elevator shaft went from the ground floor to the 4th floor. The stairs went another floor up to the 5th floor. The stairwell was actually only used by the garrison until 1943, when the civilian population was permitted to use it for seating, because there weren't enough bunker facilities in Berlin. What you can see here are the effects of the blastings. The entire stairwell has caved in, except for the area between the 5th and the 4th floor, and there are huge chunks of reinforced concrete still hanging from the walls. So it's extremely dangerous to venture down there, because in some parts, these chunks, which weigh tons, could come loose at any time, something you definitely want to avoid. Here you can see very clearly the damage caused by the blasting in '48 by the French occupying power. We're in the French sector here. As we know, Germany was to be demilitarized and bunkers were considered military structures. The French detonated 3 charges in total. The first had no effect whatsoever. The second destroyed only parts of the bunker, and only after the 3rd charge did the rear end cave in. It collapsed like a house of cards. By the way, the Soviets and the Brits had the same problems with the flak towers in their sectors. They were difficult to demolish because of the vast amounts of concrete used.
The huge concrete towers offered protection for up to 30,000 people, but also for valuable museum pieces during the Allied air raids. Even some armament production was relocated here. In the end, their heavy anti-aircraft guns were not enough to prevent the fall of Berlin. Demolishing the ruins would be far too expensive, so this relic from the Second World War will continue to be used by the bunker experts in future for research and expeditions.
Großstadtverkehr Juli 1943 in der Reichshauptstadt am Alexanderplatz. Straßenbahnen, Lastkraftwagen mit Lebensmitteln und sonstiger kriegswichtiger Ladung und ringsherum die Hochhäuser und Büros, in denen Männer und Frauen für den Sieg arbeiten.
Air raid shelter systems were built all around Berlin, including beneath the Alexanderplatz. A television film of the time about market gardening in the city centre unintentionally shows the ventilation shafts of the subterranean bunker system. Stretching over 2 stories, the Alexanderplatz bunker was the largest underground shelter in the city. According to a special plan, all mainline railway stations in Berlin were outfitted with such shelter systems during the war, with the aim of putting up travellers in the case of a bombing attack. Later in the war, residents of the area and passers-by were also allowed to use the extensive shelter.
During the final stages of the war, we had to go into the air raid shelter almost every day. By then, the war had arrived in Berlin with the bombing attacks. I remember spending many nights in the shelter. I also remember that during an event organized by the Hitler Youth, we had to go into a shelter. But because I didn't want to, I ran away and walked along the Heerstraße towards home, while the air raid was in full swing. I could see the bombers dropping their load, but I wasn't scared. I walked for over an hour from Unter den Linden all the way to Spandau, and somehow I got home unharmed.
In his function as commissary for the total war effort, Joseph Goebbels assembled Volkssturm or Home Guard divisions in late 1944 and had them march in front of the Brandenburg Gate for propaganda purposes.
Der Tag des Volkssturms ist ein kraftvoller Beweis dafür, dass kein Feindterror das deutsche Volk beugen kann und dass die Herzen seiner Menschen über Masse, Material und Hass triumphieren werden.
The elderly, members of the Hitler Youth, semi-invalids and even women were trained to use anti-tank rocket launchers with the intention of stopping the advancing Red Army. At the beginning of February 1945, Goebbels declared Berlin a fortress. Adolf Hitler had his final appearance on the newsreel of the 20th of March. The Führer decorated Hitler Youth boys who had fought Soviet units with their bazookas. Shortly before the end, even the last underage reserves were mobilized and mercilessly annihilated in street fighting. The Olympic Tower was also converted into a stronghold of fanatic Nazi no-surrender terror. Here too, child soldiers were deployed in an attempt to halt the Soviet advance into the city centre. All of those unwilling to participate in this senseless suicide mission were publicly shot.
The Volkssturm
men and Hitler Youth boys, who were the last contingent, had barricaded themselves in at several locations with orders to defend the government district. One of these places was the Reich Sports Field. At the end of April 1945, at least 3, maybe even 4,000 Hitler Youth boys confronted the far superior Red Army. How many of them died remains uncertain. I didn't want the Russians to capture Berlin, so I wanted to defend the city at any cost. Better dead than a slave was one of the slogans they had hammered into us. Self-sacrifice is an heroic deed. I honestly admit that I was quite prepared to sacrifice myself because this was how I was brought up, to defend the fatherland by all means, even accepting death.
Das Vaterland zu verteidigen, dass ich auch den Tod in Kauf genommen hätte.
The Führer didn't care about the senseless sacrifice of the Hitler Youth Boys and his soldiers. He didn't leave his last bastion alive. On the 6th of May 1945, the defenders were forced to leave the Chancellery of the Reich through the open gates of the subterranean bunkers before a running camera. This appearance of Hitler's last disciples was staged by the Soviets for the newsreel at home. The curious victors wandered across the heavily damaged seat of government of the dictator. Hitler's charred body was found buried in the garden, not far from the remains of his designated successor. Josef and Magda Goebbels had poisoned their 6 children shortly before the capitulation and then committed suicide. The history of National Socialist Berlin was over. Tanks that had participated in the capture of Berlin flanked the Soviet monument at the Reichstag, which the victors erected at the end of 1945 in memory of those fallen in the Great Patriotic War. For many decades, it was suggested that stones from Hitler's new chancellery were used in its construction to symbolize the victory over National Socialism. But this is probably just a propagandistic legend that helped to seal the fall of Hitler's Berlin.